You're isolating her.
I've already had it.
It's been a bad season. So Richard, I didn't know. I would I just jinxed myself. Good luck, Dana.
We'll sit down here.
Everybody else have a vector at home. Got a vector at work,
Congratulations on your settling into the job.
Yeah, you have to bring game.
Okay. We're done. We're starting right now. Well, we're supposed to start at 1 and we're starting with the other batches. The stories of but you might mention it.
My wife has. Cox was.
My boss.
My mom is a great grandma, good babysitter, and my dad is too, for that matter.
Too bad.
No, the way I learned it wasn't. I don't think so because you guys want to go ahead and
Oh, hey, how are you? Yeah.
Okay. Do you need it beforehand or is after? Okay. Okay. Blue cards. Blue cards for all of you.
So is it like Kelsey?
Okay, good. He's here.
Hi, Ron. Hi, Walter. How are you? Wow. Did you have a good holiday? Did you get a break? Yeah. Every day there's something. We'll see you. So you're not going to the water music conference, right? Well, I hope I catch up to you sometime. Next week we're going with DWR on that integrated operations. Oh, yes. I think that's on Thursday. We have Gary Hardin, John, and you. That'd be good. I got some interesting things to go through, but I've not seen any yet.
Okay.
That's right.
All right, good afternoon. I'm sorry. We're getting started a little late, and it's taken us all a little time to assemble. But we'll be with each other for a while. Thank you. Thank you for joining us, all these familiar faces and some that aren't. Today, Diane will talk about the context for today, but this afternoon's presentation is for the state and federal agencies to give us an update on the drought contingency plan, which was filed on the 15th and is publicly available to help walk us through it and understand it. No action will be taken today. This is a group effort at understanding what is in it in the first instance. So there's more I'll probably say in the course of the day, but with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Diane Riddle to actually walk through the document. Is there anything, Karen, else we should say about what it is and isn't? Or is that in? Fine, let's just get right to it.
Good afternoon, Chair Marcus and board members. Again, I'm Diane Riddle. I'm the Environmental Program Manager for the Hearings in Bay Delta section. Again, I'll provide a little bit of background on how we got to where we're at today with the drought contingency plan, and then I'll turn it over to the Department of Water Resources to provide an update on the current hydrology and an overview of the drought contingency plan. Uh-oh. Sorry. As you probably recall, last year, after a series of dry years, we were in the position where the projects didn't feel that they could meet Delta water quality requirements included in Decision 1641, which led to a petition to the board on January 29th, 2014 to modify Delta requirements. The executive director approved that temporary urgency change petition on January 31st and issued a series of modifications to that order on various dates over the year, covering additional changes and updating the order on the temporary urgency change petition. Then on September 24th, the board issued the order on denying the petitions for reconsideration and addressing objections to the executive director's order. And that's where the requirement for the drought contingency plan and other requirements came from. So in an effort to better plan for future dry conditions and ensure that we were coordinated and planning for the future, the order on reconsideration required the projects to develop a water year 2015 drought contingency plan in coordination with the fishery agencies that addressed delta flows and reservoir operations. Specifically, the drought contingency plan was required to identify the biological and other bases for the drought contingency plan, minimum monthly flow and storage conditions, considering needs for delta salinity control, fish protection, and municipal supplies under a 50, 90, and 99% hydrology, as well as any other information requested by the board. The drought contingency plan was to be submitted in two parts. The first part was due on October 15th, and we received that plan, and it was to cover the October 15th through January 15th time period. At that time, very little was known about the hydrology, so there wasn't a lot of information in it. The drought contingency plan that we just got last week really has the meat of the drought contingency plan to date and covers the remainder of the water year from January 15th to September 30th. That plan acknowledges, and we acknowledge that the hydrology and other factors may change throughout the year, so there'll probably be needed changes to the contingency plan as we move forward. Another requirement in the drought contingency plan is that the board consider comments received on the drought contingency plan as we consider any potential temporary urgency change requests from the projects. So I think this will be our first opportunity perhaps to hear from the public on their initial impressions of the plan and any concerns or comments they have. So in addition to the drought contingency plan, the order on reconsideration included a requirement for a Sacramento River temperature management plan. This is an existing requirement in order 90-5. We reiterated this requirement and added some specificity to it. Specifically, we required a plan for 2015 to protect winter run Chinook salmon spawning and rearing period. That plan was required to be submitted on January 15th as well. The projects included the requirements for that plan and the drought contingency plan, so I mentioned that here. That plan is required to consider other fishery needs, spring run and fall run, specifically to identify actions throughout the year that will be taken to protect storage, cold water pool, and flows under different hydrologic conditions to protect winter run and other Sacramento River fish from red dewatering, stranding, and temperature impacts. And again, the Sacramento River Temperature Management Plan is also required to be updated based on changing conditions or at the request of the board. So again, this will be the first opportunity for the board to hear comments from the public. I imagine we might receive further comments as we move forward. If conditions remain dry, the drought contingency plan looks as if there will likely be the need for potential changes to delta requirements that the projects will be requesting. And I expect DWR and the Bureau will go over those potential changes that they may be requesting in the future. So far, the Executive Director did receive a request from the Bureau of Reclamation to modify delta salinity requirements at Vernalis. The Executive Director responded to that request and stated that it appeared as if the problem might be limited in time, and instead deferred action on the request until the board could consider the drought contingency plan. So with that, that's kind of an update of how we got to where we're at today. I'll now turn it over to Bill Croyle, who will provide an update on the current hydrology.
Good afternoon. I think we have a PowerPoint.
Oh, good. And just a reminder to everyone who speaks, because you were not here other than a couple of exceptions in the morning meeting, emergency evacuation procedures in this room, look for an exit sign. You hear an emergency noise, it is, take your stuff, be careful, walk outside, and we convene near 10th and J if you want to know when the all clear comes. Also, when you come up and speak at the microphone, and that's true for the ones down here, you need to get your mouth ridiculously close to it like a rock star so that people can actually hear you who aren't just us, the folks in the back of the room, the folks listening over the web. This is a real opportunity for education and thought and people thinking through a tough situation together, so we want to make sure everybody can hear you. I can't do it, so I have this pinned to my, so I don't underestimate how hard it is to do.
Okay. Good afternoon, Chairman Marcus, Bill, and board, and members of the audience. My name is Bill Croyle with the Department of Water Resources, Drought Manager. So it's Full Employment Act for those of us working on drought these days. What we're here today to do is give an update on the drought contingency plan that was released. So we're going to go through a little bit of situational awareness on hydrology, tiny bit maybe on forecast, then move on to our current reservoir conditions, and then hear from both the state and federal projects. And then we also, fortunately, have our partner fish agencies with us today, not necessarily by presentation, but the request state water board staff in case there's questions and stuff. I think the people you have before you, we're missing one agency, but I think have really worked hard, more than a year together on difficult issues like this. So the real-time water operations team has been meeting, or parts of that team, almost on a daily basis as we move through this, and certainly over the last month or so on this particular issue. There's more work to be done, and that'll be part of our future dialogue. Next slide. I don't have a clicker. There we go. Thank you. So what I want to do real quick is, most of us may already be aware of this, but I think it's a good kind of foundation to build this discussion on. First of all, this is a governor declared drought emergency. It was declared about this time this last year. We are coming off of our third, or 2004 being our third driest water year statewide when we look at this. And I think some of the important attributes are also coming out is our driest 3 consecutive years, and that's really important as we look at our surface water and groundwater resources that are needed to meet our needs across the state. Our statewide storage is below average. Some of the projects might be doing better as compared to this date last year, but I think when you look at overall, the state has lost storage due to these dry conditions, the use, even though many of us are stepping up on the conservation and going without.
Our groundwater basins continue to be tapped for those that do not have access to surface water or need to replace some of that surface water with groundwater resources. And obviously, there's a lot of energy going into looking at what's our current conditions, use rates, and that'll obviously, with the latest legislation and bond funds, is lots of topic for a future meeting. Our local conditions continue to degrade, and I think that's all the way from the environmental impacts, our agricultural impacts, our rural, and our urban areas. And so that's, all of us that are working on the drought task force and many of the local and state and federal agencies working together. This is, I think, an important part as we kind of step through the driest or the typically wettest time of year, and it maintains dry, even though we've had some significant rains in December. There continues to be a high level of federal, state, and local coordination. I think, again, the RT.DOT team is where we have our federal and state partners working very closely, again, on a very frequent basis to make decisions, address challenges that we have, and develop plans like we have before us today. Also, we've been talking about for a while lessons learned from Australia. That on a millennium drought, we need to plan for a dry condition, especially as, even when it looked like it was going to potentially get wet. I think, January is turning out to be pretty dry. I just saw the 10-day forecast for the the A-station index up north, and it looks dry through the end of the month. And so that makes, again, January a really challenging part of our hydraulic history this year. So
I was in the Sierras this weekend around Tahoe, and it was heartbreaking. It looked like May, where you might be nothing on the side of the road. It was unbelievable how dry it was. It did not look like January.
Yeah, I was in Southern California this weekend, and it was a little warm, and the trees looked a little singed on the edges throughout the region. I want to step back a little bit. Obviously, our drought monitor is one of the tools. We use many tools, but really the drought monitor is kind of a global perspective on how we're doing on drought conditions. It takes a number of factors into consideration when they update these graphics out of NOAA. I wanted to start with this one first because, it's a West Coast drought. Certainly the Southwest and the West Coast has been an extended dry period. So, of course, it's about California. We've taken a significant hit here over the last almost 2-3 years. Some of us think a little bit longer, but I think this is a good measure of how we're doing, whether it's every week or month to month, or in this case, over the last couple years. This is our graphic that we use a lot as we go around and kind of where we're at. This particular graphic is updated on the 13th of this month. Again, it's updated on a regular basis. We have seen some changes statewide. It's a little better than it was, say, 2 months ago when we were extreme was right around 92% and exceptional up around 56-60%. However, we have a number of local agencies continue to declare local drought emergencies. We have tribals and counties declaring and continuing to re-declare those drought emergencies. This is a graphic, and working with John this morning, we were looking at how it's kind of going and the different perspectives that are out there. And so I went back and looked at what it looked like last year. And I think that's important because this is about when the governor's office, well, some of us had already spun up, but the governor's office and all of the state agencies came together under the drought task force. And we have the graphic on the left is where we were with regard to the drought monitor on our extreme conditions at 63% throughout the state, an exceptional 0. And so when you move forward to this time this year, it's a little rougher. 78% of us extreme drought and 39% exceptional drought. So it's extremely dry conditions. It is slightly better than it was as we saw with the rains in December, but we're quickly going back into extremely difficult conditions statewide. I would also note when I looked at this graphic, I see some of the most exceptional, the impacts of the exceptional drought area identified on the graphic on the right is the area where the state and federal water projects provide a lot of relief to the extent they have water to relieve. And so it's kind of ground zero, whether you're environmental, agriculture, rural, or urban. I think that's all part of this story that we're trying to address on these challenges. Yeah, I think John and I were talking about where we start here, and I thought we just came out with the January 20th graphic kind of in the last hour or so we were able to slip this graphic in. So this is a sad state of affairs with regard to our snowpack, our largest water supply here in California, and I think the critical part, which is not on this graphic, is the one that we had for yesterday, which is 36%. And so again, just over this weekend, as we go back out and look at our sensors, just over the last 3 days, we've lost 5% of our snowpack. And I think that's telling of the kind of hydrologic and weather cycle we're in right now, which is dry humidity, obviously not a lot of precipitation. There has been precipitation events around, but again, it's very little. I think the highest levels of the Southern Sierras got a little bit of snow here recently, but again, overall, the regions of the state that really do need to receive that critical snowpack isn't receiving it. So with that, I'll turn the clicker over to John.
Thank you, Bill. Sobering.
Okay, yes, thanks, Bill. Good afternoon, Chair Marcus, other board members. So, yeah, I think I'll just continue on. This is, kind of foundational information on what went into our drought contingency plan. Certainly we have described the current conditions, and Bill just went over these dismal numbers for the snowpack. I don't believe if they are better than last year, they're not a whole heck of a lot better. I think one of the reasons you see the big change in these numbers going down is, to date, is the expectation is we be building snowpack right now, and that is not happening. There we go. One of the parameters, so I'm going to go over some of the precipitation numbers and then some of the storages. I think Ron and I will do some tag teaming on the storages. But I'll set the stage a little bit more here quickly on the precip to date. This one, of course, can be somewhat misleading when you look at the Northern Sierra precip, which shows essentially almost average to date. We just have now fallen below average to date because of this extended dry period since about the third week of December. But of course, those storms were very warm storms, and so did not help the snowpack much at all in the December period. So the runoff would have been directly into the storages, and we'll go over those storages in a bit. There was big deficits to make up from the previous dry year in those storages, so there was some relief there, but not nearly enough, and we'll take a look at that in a second here. I think the bigger story here is also the San Joaquin Basin. Even in terms of precip, it's been nowhere near average precipitation, unlike the Northern Sierra. Northern Sierra is not doing well at all, but the San Joaquin Basin's a whole nother category. This falls on the heels of a couple critically dry years, much drier even than the Sacramento Basin, and those storages are even in worse shape than the Sacramento. We've got the Tulare. This is a new product as of this year that's on CDEC, which breaks out the Tulare Basin Precip 6 station in addition to the Northern Sierra and the Southern Sierra. Same state as the San Joaquin Basin. So reservoir conditions, right here we'll take a look at kind of the absolute condition that the major reservoirs are in. It's kind of a mixed bag, if you will. They're all substantially below average for this time of year. Certainly, the Trinity, Shasta, Oroville, Folsom's is doing probably of all of the major project reservoirs doing a little bit better than we were last year at this time. New Maloney's is certainly one of the negatives as far as the precipitation, as far as storage is concerned. You take a look at any of the storages on the San Joaquin Basin, and pretty dismal numbers there. San Luis Reservoir doing a little bit better than last year. That's maybe one of the brighter spots, but again, that's well below average for this time of year. And again, I'll let Ron jump in anytime he would like to make a comment on the storages. I will start out by saying that Trinity, when you look at Shasta storage, we're going to look at that in a second. It's a little better than average, a little better than where we were last year at this time. But if you take a combination of both Trinity and Shasta combined, actually in worse condition than last year. So I think that's one of the key points we want here. So again, here is Shasta storage in the blue. Like I said, doing a little better than last year, but a combination of the previous slide with Trinity and Shasta, not so much. Oroville doing slightly better than last year. We had that a big deficit of 500,000 acre-feet to make up at the coming into the water year, so that's what December did for us. We were able to make up that deficit, but only slightly better than last year at this time. As I'd mentioned, Folsom is doing quite a bit better than last year, although there's not really a snowpack behind these storage numbers as we had discussed as far as the warmer storms that we saw in December. New Melones, really this is telling. You can see about half the storage of where we were last year at this time. So San Joaquin Basin is, as I said, a whole nother level of concern as far as the drought is concerned. San Luis conditions, doing better than we were last year at this time, still substantially below average for this point in time. So I wanted to cover a little bit, and Bill made some reference to this. This is the various water year types and the SWP allocation, and for each of those years. So you see wet, blue, green above normal, yellow below normal, orange dry, and red critically dry. We've seen in the last, this is going on the 4th year of the current drought. We did have 2011, which was a wet year, which in a sense reset some of the storages upstream in the basin. But this is on the heels of, if you recall, we had a 3 to 4 year drought just prior to that wet year. So if you look at this in the whole, we're talking about 7 out of the last 8 years have been below normal or drier. And this is the Sacramento Basin. San Joaquin is not even looking this good. The last time, you have to go back in the historical record, and if you add this year into the mix, we're talking 8 out of the last 9 years. So we're getting close to an entire decade of all but 1 year being below average precipitation and runoff. You have to go back to the kind of the Dust Bowl 1930s to see any period that's similar to this. As a result, you see the shortages to our customers, which, as you recall, represents over 25 million Californians, 750,000 acres of farmland in the Central Valley. There's been shortages to these folks for the last 8 years. We're going on 9 years of their supplies. In fact, you can see the average there's been less than 50% or over 50% shortage of the supplies. And what this has been doing over time is depleting the local sources, the other sources of supply in these service areas. So you see greatly depleted groundwater, you see greatly depleted surface water storage in the state water contractors, local supplies, So this has been building, and of course, the last couple of years have been particularly devastating as far as the low allocation. This slide I'm gonna hand off to Ron to give a little description here. I think this goes into our forecasting and the exceedances.
Good afternoon, Chair Marcus and the rest of the board. As you can see, John handed me the slide that was just, obvious by looking at it. And probably because I asked that we include something like this. And what this is if you think about this as perhaps tracking, let's say, maybe from a financial sector, a stock, if you will. In this particular slide, we have the Sacramento Basin. This is the forecast of runoff. We've combined Shasta, Oroville, Englebright on the Yuba, and then Folsom. And we've included two sets of dots kind of running. There's kind of a red square that's been running here for a time, and that's a running estimate almost daily of what the 50% exceedance estimate of the combined runoff would be. And as you can see, I'll just pick that one as a trace. We started at something that was potentially early in the water year. At that time, you thought, well, you've got a 50-50 chance of hitting an about average. If you look way over on the right-hand side, there's a green triangle. That's the target that would represent an average runoff. So hopefully these things would track to something that would hit above that. And things started looking a little drier as we went through November. When we saw the storms in December, there was a sense of optimism based on that continuing potentially, and the estimates on a weekly basis started to increase. And then as we got into, let's say, the latter part of December, these numbers have tended to be, sliding as each couple of days of dry weather and forecasted dry weather continued. There's that particular trace in this graph. There's also a blue one, which would represent 90% exceedance, which was fairly low expectations at the beginning of the water year. In like manner, during December, there was a little more optimism that we could maintain a track that would get us to a higher point, but that has also slid a bit. What we've also done here is captured at the first part of December and the first part of January. These black dots that you see are the DWR Bulletin 120 estimates of runoff as it would equate to these particular basins. Starting at the 90, the 75, the mid dot is the 50, then the 25, or excuse me, the 10%, the 25 being the wet ones, the 50 being the middle dot, the 75% exceedance forecast, the 90, and then the 99. And you can see going from December 1st to January 1st how those dots shifted upwards based on the hydrology of December. And we will see if those, my expectation is those, as we look ahead to February 1st, will track along the lines of these kind of weekly or daily projections. And then there's a series of dots that connect up from last year to give you an idea as to where they kind of honed in. This is, some parlance, they call this kind of a funnel diagram, which means you have wide variability of the statistics at the beginning of the year, but they all start moving towards a point that by the time we get to spring, the die is pretty well cast as to what you'll get. So we've done that for the Sac Basin on these kind of four critical basins, sub-basins there. We did a similar thing for the San Joaquin, and you'd see very similar results here, with one exception I'd like to point out, is that the forecast at the beginning of December and then the beginning of January from the DWR forecast, on the wetter end, were less optimistic when we got to the 1st of January than we were in December. A little more optimistic on the drier side. And this is just to point out that although December we talk about, gee, wasn't that a great start? Actually, from a precip standpoint, for the San Joaquin Basin, it was actually still below normal or below average. That's only been magnified by the lack of snowpack. The San Joaquin system is, a bit more high in elevation, so it has a more significant snow element to it when you think about water management. And given that number is not so hot, these projections are becoming more of a concern. I think a point as we think about objectives, delta objectives, is that, knock on wood, some improvements in the overall basin may help take off some of the conflict that we may experience if we see some improvement. But I think the San Joaquin is going to be the lagging indicator. For the last 3 years, we've seen, maybe going to the 4th year now, a much of a skew to the north. The Sacramento has been faring better than the San Joaquin, and this cumulative effect that John talked about is really coming home to roost in the San Joaquin. You see it particularly in New Maloney storage. You certainly see it in the storage on the Merced at Exchequer. They're below 70,000 acre-feet of storage there now, and that's a concern as we think about Vernalis flows, I think, going into the spring. This will be something we'll want to track and probably discuss in great detail as we progress through the rest of the water year. John, who do we want to... I'll come back and probably talk a bit about some of the dynamics as they relate to Sac river temperature management and Shasta storage, and got a couple comments about Trinity that relate to that. But John, who do we want? I can talk off of this too if we like.
Go right ahead.
Okay. So last week we submitted our drought contingency plan based on as best a snapshot as we could get on January 15th. This is an extension of the material that we provided in October. And as Diane mentioned, well, a lot has happened since October, but there's still a lot ahead of us in terms of what's going on in terms of water management and some of these decisions. We talked about and thought through some of the health and safety needs going forward, both thinking about the quantities that are involved and given the storages that we have, but also trying to think about the quality side of the equation in terms of salinity management. Are delta barriers going to be needed as we go later on in the year if it's extremely dry? And there's some discussion there about where we think the trigger points would be that start that discussion. But also in a little, not as dramatic sense, management of salinity as it relates to the objectives going through the February, March into April timeframe, and what's a balancing of that with not only water for salinity management and supply, but also fishery needs as it relates to the use of the water we already have in storage upstream. We tried to give a lot of thought to issues related to the environmental concerns, whether that's cold water pool management upstream, in conjunction with delta fisheries in terms of outflow, so kind of a pelagics versus, or in contrast with some of the upstream salmon, salmonids concerns, and then also thinking about supplies and needs as they relate to refuges. Refuges had, at least from a CVPIA standpoint for reclamation, had less water last year than they've had for a number of years, and we had quite a few birds in the system, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out as the year progresses. And then we wanted to give some thought to how do you balance this in a beneficial use standpoint from the potential economic impact of all this adding up as it relates to agriculture. That ties into groundwater management to a degree. What do we need for the municipal industrial half of M&I versus health and safety only? And we tried to give some discussion of that within the plan as well. And as Bill had said, we include a 50%, 90%, 99% exceedance forecast based on January 1st that we attempted to grapple with. One of the challenges is with the dry January, and that being typically our wettest month. thinking about, well, how do we adjust some of these assumptions from these operational scenarios, knowing that we're not getting, well, we weren't getting a 50% January, we weren't really getting a 90% January. So even as you're doing a 50% exceedance forecast, you know January, your wettest component is looking more like a 99. That presents some challenges in trying to be consistent with that and in discussing that in the document. And as we think through potentially objectives that the projects would see, that we would entertain the idea of maybe asking for some modifications through. We tried to think about them on the tracks of those 3 exceedances, but almost immediately we saw some crossover there. Even if it's February starts getting wetter, we've got some concerns here leading into the first part of February. So I think that's the summary of what we provided. I'm sure as folks delve into that and the projects start working with the fishery agencies from the state and federal level, thinking about what might be prudent actions here as we get into February, we'll probably be adding more detail to this. And as much work as this effort was, I envision that we'll be updating these for the next few months as we get new forecasts, and tuning up both our expectations about for the rest of the season, as well as what is immediately on the horizon as it relates to operations. John and Bill, was there anything else we wanted to cover there?
I think that's probably good for now. We had a couple more slides, but that might help with answering detail questions or what have you. But I think this sums it up pretty well.
At least as it relates to the contingency plan. Now, one of the key elements in the board's order from back in October was to start thinking about temperature management on the Upper Sacramento. And as we kind of point out in the document, a couple things. One, the actions that we would see at this time of year to help manage cold water pool and think about a temperature management plan for the spring and summer are really intertwined with just the conservation of upstream storage. That's the most significant driver, and for the example of Sacramento River, the biggest driver, although not the only one, is storage within Shasta and what we would expect to see by the time we got to the end of April. And with the place that we are within the water year at this point, and there's a significant range of what Shasta inflows would be between now and the end of April. On this particular graphic, we apply some kind of rules of thumb.
Can you be really beginner about this? Because I got
Sure.
caught up on this chart.
Okay.
I was having, that's where
Okay.
I started putting the Post-its.
Okay, sure. So let's just talk about the mechanics of the chart itself. On the lower axis, we have overall storage at Shasta as of the end of April. And on the vertical axis, we have something that would equate to the amount of water that be in storage at that point in time at Shasta that's below 52 degrees. And that's a pool of cold water that we would have. Now, when we get closer to April, get into May, and as we progress through the summer, every 2 weeks we actually do a sounding at Shasta Lake to define how much cold water we have and what's the stratification of the lake look like. The dashed line that kind of traverses diagonally through here, at this point in time is just a rough rule of thumb as to what the typical relationship would be to that volume of water at the end of April to a total volume of water in Shasta. So at this point, being we don't have a good handle on how much more we would really have and what a stratification of the lake might look like based on a springtime, we've kind of made an assumption here that we would track along this relationship. So based on the operational forecast that we constructed for the contingency plan, the large, and it could have been a larger dot. I kind of lobbied for a bigger dot given some uncertainties, but this is probably about as big a dot as I think we could probably find appropriate at this point. The upper right-hand dot would be if we did have a 50% exceedance set of runoffs into Shasta, with the provisions that we've thought through about minimizing releases as best as we can through that period, we actually would get a pretty good temperature performance out of the lake. We would be high enough in the reservoir to allow us to utilize the full set of shutters on the temperature control device and could actually manage temperatures to 56 degrees through the summer into the fall, all the way down to at least Ball's Ferry, probably into Jelly's Ferry. So that would be our expectation if we had that set of dynamics. As we move to a drier scenario like the 90% exceedance, and given the storages that we started with at the 1st of January, as we progress down this line, we're probably looking at a much lower lake level at this point. And unfortunately, this starts looking a lot like the temperature dynamics that we had set up this last year, which would put us at some place trying to manage at a point just upstream of the confluence with Clear Creek. With not being able to operate all the shutters at the lake because the lake didn't fill enough, so the upper set of shutters really is not functional for temperature management. So we have one less set of tools to help manage this, and we would be down at the very bottom of the cold water pool would be, the top of the cold water pool would be right around the place where the side gates are on the temperature control device, which, depending on how the lake stratifies, is very difficult to figure out how it's going to operate in the sense of how the cold water can get drawn into the penstocks. Certainly, the cold water pool becomes below the lowest level outlet for the river outlets, making that an option that's no longer particularly viable. So we get to a point where we start seeing very sketchy ability to be able to manage. The third dot, which is not even on here, would be if you have a 99% exceedance, which would imply that we don't have any real expectation that we could manage temperatures at 56 degrees in the Sacramento River or even at the outlets at Keswick for an extended period. That coupled with the graphic and the discussion that John had about Trinity storage is much lower at this state than it was a year ago. And Trinity can help be managed in a way that brings some cold water over and be able to mix into this. But in these drier forecasts, we don't see that as a viable option this year. We're going to be struggling with meeting temperature objectives on the Trinity and maintaining an appropriate carryover storage there. So we have one less tool or degree of flexibility in this. Regrettably, if we were to track along a 99% exceedance, we'd be working with our fishery colleagues about, in essence, a contingency plan for winter run that may be a more significant set of actions to get spawning fish out of the river and maybe heading to more of a hatchery operation if that's the track that we found ourselves upon. It certainly isn't ideal, but we wouldn't see if you have, that's the hydrology that you had. Unfortunately, that you could count on the management of temperatures within Shasta and Keswick/Trinity to be able to give us any real likelihood of success. So we didn't include the dot here. It's kind of at the edge of the universe here anyway. So that's the dynamic of the temperature component, and I hope I'm certainly willing to answer more questions about this graph.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to look at the PowerPoint that came in just a little while ago, so I don't know what's beyond this. Can you, if you already have a slide on this, then I can wait for whenever you want to do it, but can you talk a little bit about lessons learned in what you're, in each of these things, in terms of what you put into the plan and why you put it into the plan? I know that obviously struggled with temperature at the end of the season for salmon. If you can talk a little bit about the impact last year and why you did anything different in this one than the year before, and also you could also go through this in even more detail. Know that not everybody listening on the web, or maybe in the room, looking at the room, most of the room's probably read it at least once, but don't assume someone's read the drought contingency plan. So to explain,
Sure.
the purpose of this in some ways, in addition to helping us understand it, is a minor thing we can ask you. It's for us to hear from you, for other people to understand your thinking in advance, and to be able to engage really with all of us, you all and us, in the comments of things to watch for. So I'm just going to be looking for, I won't catch them all, but looking for things that would be helpful to the, maybe not average person, but the expert public and the questions they would ask. So a simpler question would be, how are you approaching Sacramento River temperature, given that some stuff didn't go the way we all planned last year?
Sure. I'll ask Bill a question. Do we have a slide on overall lessons learned? Okay. Having said that,
Yeah, that would be
we
cool.
have
We
to
should have
start-
asked you for that, I'm sorry.
We have, so we'll start someplace. So let's start on the Sac River temperatures.
Okay.
Couple things that we learned last year, particularly in a year where where we knew that we would likely have the cold water pool, or the coldest water that we were tapping into, so the sub 52 degrees Fahrenheit pool, would be down at the side gates of the structure. And I apologize, we don't have a slide that kind of illustrates what this contraption looks like
If you
that
could
we're
send
talking
one,
about.
that would be great.
We
later.
certainly will do
Yeah.
that. But there's something called the side gates. I mean, the chambers on the front of the structure, where there's 3 sets of shutters, they kind of face out towards the lake. And they're at different elevations, and they allow, as water stratifies in the lake, you can try to selectively withdraw temperatures to kind of conserve that cold water. But towards the end of the season, we had anticipated that that cold water pool would start to be right around the area where these side gates were operational. And back in our earlier experiences in the first years that the gate was installed, this was always a dicey operation because we don't have a lot of experience on operating the side gates when where the layers of the warm water and the cold water are very much in the vicinity of this. As we go through this as the lessons learned, because this could get very detailed, the stratification of the lake in late August into September was very interesting in that you had a very large mass of very warm water sitting on top of very cold water with a transition of only like 10 feet going for just 2 layers. So it's not like it was from the top of the lake down being very gradual. And when that interface was right there in the vicinity of the gates, we were trying several configurations of operations of the powerhouse to try to coax the cold water in. Do you pulse it? Do you kind of flat load it? Do you just jump over to the low-level outlets and try to see if you can get better cold water performance there? So one thing that we learned there is if our plan is hanging on our ability to consistently draft cold water when we get it down to that level, I think we need to show some concern there because there's a significant uncertainty involved. Interestingly, one of the bullets that Bill had on his kind of summary of 2014 was that 2014 was a record warm year in terms of overall temperatures. And although you can't point to 10, 12 days of over 100-degree weather like we've seen in some years, that overall consistently warm weather takes a toll on this stratification process. And I think that contributed to some degree this very warm mass that we saw heading down all the way to the cold water pool. I think that a lesson that we did learn was we were making a very good set of decisions as it related to 2014 versus 2013, in that some of the objectives that we worked on collectively to conserve water upstream were well-founded, in that if we had made reservoir releases at Shasta in the late winter, spring for some of the outflow objectives, at least as it related to temperature management, would have just compounded this problem even further. I think that the degree that we did get some winter run stock out of the river into hatchery production, I think was a success story that we really need to keep that in our thinking if we get to this lower end of the configuration, and is again relying on the side gate at the structure should lake levels get that low. And I also think that the work that we instituted this last year, reclamation, working very closely with Sac River settlement contractors on their diversion pattern. If we remember back into April of 2013, we had tremendous demands on the river in a dry spring that had releases at Keswick going up to 10, 12, 13,000 CFS, that working with the settlement contractors this last year, we were able to push those types of diversions much further into lining up with our temperature releases. So I think that just confirmed that that was a worthwhile area that we endeavored at that point, and that we would want to build upon this next year as things get dry. If we are trying to conserve water in Shasta, which I think we would do even with the wetter scenarios, just because we're trying to build storage, I think that will be significant again this coming year.
So are you targeting, and again, it's probably in there, are you targeting reserving more water and storage than you did last year? Because the amount
Sure.
again, you all did an awesome job under impossible circumstances, but you've had time to think about what you might have done differently in terms of what you're presenting.
I think in terms of targeting, this is a little bit of, and I don't want this to be construed as avoiding the question, but I think what we've let happen last year, which I think was appropriate, is let the management of temperatures guide where we end up. And not that anyone was targeting 1.1 million acre feet at the end of September. Actually, that was a little better than we had in our drought plan from the April of that year. We saw that overall volume doesn't necessarily equate to better temperatures. So where we were last spring was let's take actions to conserve the storage at Shasta, as an example. Same thing was applying to Folsom and Orville as well. Let's conserve this storage as best that we can until we get to the point, in the case of Shasta, to make those releases to manage the cold water pool and try to stretch that out and manage the operations of the temperature control device. So it's kind of a work this thing through, think about where we're at. Are we pacing ourselves too quickly because of ambient air temperatures or what have you? And then once we get past the temperature season, think about questions about stranding and how you modify going from a higher flow to a lower flow and get to a low flow as quickly as you can. And we get to the place that we are today. I think going into this next year, since the fall, we've been minimizing releases at Keswick to 3,250 CFS.